Welcome to Women Lead, a production of the Women of Color Empowerment Institute, Inc. We are your hosts. I'm Bernadette Norris Weeks.
I'm Michelle Austin Pammies.
And I'm Kathy Eggleston.
While the name of our show is Women Lead, today's theme is literally that. We will be discussing a well-researched new book on the subject called When Women Lead, What We Achieve, Why We Succeed, and What We Can Learn.
The book's author, Julia Boorstin, has been an on-air reporter for CNBC since 2006 and is currently its senior media and tech correspondent. She also created and launched the CNBC Disruptor 50, an annual list of private companies transforming the economy and challenging companies in established industries. A graduate of Princeton University, Julia also helped launch the network's Closing the Gap initiative, covering the people and companies closing gender and diversity gap.
This is an important new book on women leading in business, and the author interviewed more than 120 women leaders along with many others. Not surprisingly, she found many stories of female company founders having to overcome barriers not faced by men, but she also was so inspired by the stories of resilience of many of these leaders that she wanted to codify what they were doing differently to succeed. Kathy and Michelle, I think that some of these concrete nuggets are going to be great takeaways for our viewers.
We have a lot to discuss with our guest today, CNBC senior correspondent and author of the new book, Julia Boorstin. I predict you'll hear Julia's findings quoted for years to come, but you'll hear it here first. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages.
The law office of Austin Pammies Norris Weeks Powell is a full-service law firm practicing in the area of governmental law, including the representation of municipalities, civil litigation, personal injury, real estate, and corporate transactional matters. With over 100 years of collective experience, our attorneys are admitted to practice before state courts, federal courts, and the United States Supreme Court. We are conveniently located in downtown Fort Lauderdale and can be reached at 954-768-9770. Or for more information about the law firm of Austin Pammies Norris Weeks Powell, visit our website at apnwlaw.com. That's apnwlaw.com.
Welcome back to Women Lead. We are pleased to have joining us from Los Angeles, Julia Boorstin, author of the new book published by Simon & Schuster, When Women Lead, What We Achieve, Why We Succeed, and What We Can Learn. Julia, thank you for being with us. I want to know the answer to all three of those questions in the title of your book, but let's start with this question. Why did you write this book?
Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor and a pleasure to get to talk to you and to talk to your audience. I wrote this book because I've been a business reporter for over 20 years, first at Fortune magazine and for the past 16 years at CNBC. And in that time, I've interviewed literally thousands of people, thousands of CEOs, executives, leaders of different companies and organizations. And the vast majority of them have been men, predominantly white men, because that is who holds the majority of positions of power in business. But especially in the past 5 years, I started to notice more and more women creating fascinating companies, holding leadership roles. And I noticed that these women were exceptions to the rule, to the dominant people who were running these companies. But not only were they exceptions, they also seemed exceptional to me. I saw them addressing problems differently, solving problems, planning for the long term. And then when it came to the entrepreneurs, the people who were founding their own companies, I was so impressed by the women. And I saw on one hand that the barriers for them were super high. And on the other hand, the way they were succeeding was incredibly inspiring for me. I would leave these interviews excited to go take on the world. And I thought, I want other people to know their stories. People need to know that successful leaders come in all shapes and sizes. and with all sorts of different backgrounds. So I wanted to help spread some of those stories about what successful leaders have done and how so many women are finding different ways to succeed. So I started off down this path of interviewing women to tell their stories. I interviewed over 120 women. And as I was going through these interviews, I realized that they have a lot of commonalities, and I needed the research. I needed the data. So I wasn't just going to say, look at these exceptional, inspiring women. I wanted to say, look at the ways they're leading. What they're doing is actually more effective than traditional top-down, more traditionally male leadership. And I realized as I dug into the data, if I could combine the stories and the research, that I could kind of create a roadmap for everyone to understand these new models of leadership.
You interviewed so many women business leaders for this book, and you've said that everyone leads differently. But you did find some common characteristics among these successful women leaders. What were some of those characteristics?
Well, the one thing I have to say is that this old-fashioned vision of what a leader looks like, it's a guy in a suit on Wall Street, or it's a younger guy in a hoodie in Silicon Valley. Those stereotypes of what leaders look like do not really represent the wealth and diversity of female leaders who I met. And furthermore, I thought this old-fashioned way of leading with a guy in a corner office telling people what to do, top-down management, that's actually not what's working right now. And it's not how people are leading and finding success right now. So what I discovered is that everyone really leads in different ways. And the people who are most successful are successful because they found a way to lead that is authentic to them, that works with their personal strengths and is really true to who they are. And the most surprising thing to me, and actually the most inspiring thing as well, was the idea that we can all be successful by pushing ourselves and developing our own leadership traits, what I call leadership superpowers. And the one consistent thing I found across all these people is that no one was born a leader. No one was born with what it takes to be successful. All of them got there, created these incredibly powerful, game-changing companies because they pushed themselves to improve and still are pushing themselves to improve every day. So this idea that we can all get better at what we do, that is the one thing that all of these successful women had in common.
You also talk about concrete leadership strategies that you uncovered female leaders using, perhaps more than their male counterparts. What were some of those successful strategies that came up often?
Well, actually, before I get to the strategies, let me tell you about these skills, these sort of inner strengths and traits, which I probably should have added before. So female leaders tend to have different approaches, and that tends to be sort of core to who they are. For instance, female leaders are more likely to lead with empathy. There are a lot of tests that found that women are better at empathy than men are. This is not an innate biological thing. This is something that is trained and socialized from the time that girls are very young. I have a fun empathy test on my website, juliaboorstin.com. You could test how well you could judge what someone is thinking based on a black and white photo of just the top half of their face. So empathy is essential. Now, empathy is important for business because it helps you put yourself in the shoes of the other people who are, say, your customers. You want to understand what your customers really want. Maybe your customers are having a harder time now because of inflation. You want to be able to put yourself in the shoes of your employees to really connect with them, to understand if they're frustrated or what it'll take to really motivate them. So empathy is key. Another key skill, which is really interesting, is vulnerability. Vulnerability has often been thought of as weakness, but in fact, vulnerability in leadership actually can show strength. So vulnerability, admitting what you don't know, admitting what you're good at, is really useful because it invites people to come and collaborate with you. You say, look, I'm good at this one thing, but I'm not good at this other thing. Come join me, work with me, and you take the lead on the thing that I'm not good at. So vulnerability is key. And then another one that I think is so interesting is gratitude. Women are more likely to practice gratitude. And there's an amazing study, a series of studies that have found that gratitude correlates with longer-term thinking and planning. And of course, in business, if you could think big picture and not just think about the next 2 months, but think about where you want your business to be a year, 2 years down the road, big picture, long-term thinking is essential. And I was so interested in this data about gratitude. When I started off doing these interviews, it never even occurred to me that gratitude would have anything to do with business. But I kept on interviewing women and hearing, I'm grateful for this. I do a gratitude prayer in the morning. I practice gratitude. And I realized after 3 back-to-back interviews where women talked about how gratitude is core to the way they approach the world, I went back through all my other transcripts and I found that the word gratitude, grateful, blessed came up dozens of times. So I think gratitude is really interesting and surprising because it enables that long-term perspective.
On the other hand, what does your research show about the performance of female-led companies as well as the performance of companies with more diverse leadership all around?
So female leaders are more likely to lead in a communal way. So instead of things being top down, the boss telling people what to do, the boss making the decision and telling people what to do, female leaders are more likely to pull on perspectives from across an organization. Say, here I am, I'm the boss, but before I make a decision, I want to make sure I understand what everyone else thinks, what their experience is, and how that could help educate my own decision. So that's called like a communal leadership style. There's also this idea of divergent leaderships. So if you're doing a convergent leadership, you're rushing towards a solution. So men are more likely, if there's a problem or something they need to do, to say, let's rush towards the solution and do everything we can to find a solution right now. Women are more likely to say, let's look at the big picture, sort of look at the forest instead of just focusing in on one tree. And maybe we ask about some things that are sort of tangentially related. Now, I sometimes do this with my husband when we're trying to figure something out. And he says, oh my gosh, let's just get this solution. Let's not talk about all these things that are not core to the problem. But it turns out that this big picture context can be really valuable over the long run. When you need to be adaptable, if you've already gone down the rabbit holes to figure out all the things that are tangentially related, then things have changed. You're like, we already talked about this thing that's related. Now we're more prepared to solve the problem. So that's a really interesting second one. And then third, women are more likely to found purpose-driven companies. That means companies that have some social or environmental purpose in addition to generating profits. And these days, we're increasingly see companies align their own success with having a positive impact on the world. Some research has found that women are 20% more likely than men to found a purpose-driven company. In my experience, the numbers are much higher than that. So many women I talked to really baked purpose into the outcomes of their success. And that's so valuable for so many reasons, including the fact that it's easier to motivate employees if they understand that they're not just making money, they're helping people. It's easier to attract consumers if you're selling something to say this product that you're buying, it's also going to have some positive impact. Think about back to the original model of like Tom's shoes. You buy one, you give one. Now, so that's really essential. And then here's another thing why purpose is so important. So many of the women I talked to said to me that having that additional purpose helped them push through when times got really tough. But instead of giving up, when times got tough, some of these women who created purpose-driven companies told me, I just thought if I could succeed at this, if I could push through, I know I'm going to help people. And that's important to me too. And so that gave them that extra boost that they needed to keep on fighting.
We've been talking a lot about the good in your research, the terrific skills and acumen of so many smart women leaders. But we also have to talk about some of the challenging findings. Let's start with the ability of women founders to get their startups funded. What do the statistics show about women-led companies and access to venture capital?
Here's the thing about small businesses. 42% of all small businesses are founded and run by women. And women are starting small businesses at a faster rate than men. But when it comes to access to venture capital, the fuel that can help transition a small business into a massive tech company, it is very hard for women to get access to that. Last year, female-led companies drew about 2% of all venture capital dollars. So last year, $330 billion in venture capital was invested in the United States. 2% of that went to female-led companies. Think about that. That's crazy. 2%. A bigger percentage went to companies that had a male and a female co-founder, sort of co-ed founding teams, about 15.5%. But 82% of all VC dollars last year went to male-only founding teams. To me, it's really important to understand that data because venture capital funding has massive implications for everything about how we live our lives. Think about all the apps on our phones. All those apps came from venture capital backed companies, whether it's Uber or Airbnb or Lyft. Think about all of these companies that have really had such a big impact. So the fact that women have not gotten access to capital, it changes the kind of companies that have impact in our society. And just for context, last year, the 2% that women got, that was actually down from an average of 3% over the prior decade. As of the most recent data, which is as of 2020, study after study after study shows one thing. Companies with more diversity, both racial diversity and gender diversity, perform better. They have better financial performance. What's so important about that is that companies need to understand that having diversity initiatives, being aware of their diversity and inclusion efforts is not about doing a nice thing for their employees. That's about pursuing the highest financial results. Whether you're looking at startup founders, whether you're looking at venture capital funds, the diversity within the investor pool, if you're looking at the C-suite, if you're looking at boards, every single one of those studies has found that diversity yields higher profits. So I lay out all of this research in the first chapter of my book. And what's so important for me to explain to my readers is that even though women and people of color have not had access to capital, that doesn't make sense. If investors want to make more money, they should be investing in women, and particularly women of color, the people who've had the least access to capital. Access to capital for women of color is far more challenging than for white women. Black and Latinx female founders drew 0.43% of all VC dollars. 0.43%, less than 0.5%. Those numbers are crazy. They are starting to change, and I'm hopeful that some of the more recent data from 2021 and 2022 will show increasing capital going to women of color. But the bar is incredibly high, and women of color face even higher elements of bias and stereotype that are preventing them from getting that capital.
If we have hard data telling us that diversity is a strength, is not just a feel-good phrase, it's backed by financial performance. Why is there still this disconnect with which businesses get funded versus which do not? And what do we need to do to increase the access to capital?
You're right. It's a very complicated disconnect. It doesn't make sense. Investors want to make money. So why would they be investing in women? For instance, female-led companies yield returns, yield profits a year earlier on average. So why would investors be following the money? It's a complicated answer because so much of these investments are made at the very early stages, before companies have a track record, long before they have profits, oftentimes even before they have revenue. At the seed stage or the A stage, the earliest stages of venture capital, investors are often making a bet on the individual. They're betting on the entrepreneur and their idea. So the investors, who are largely white men, are oftentimes doing what we call pattern matching. Pattern matching is a version of unconscious bias. It is a very human instinct to try to find people who are going to fit into a pattern that you've seen before. So investors are looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg. They're looking for someone who they think might be the next Jeff Bezos. They're not looking for someone who's going to be a new type of leader. It's hard to fit someone who doesn't look or sound like the guys they've seen before into that box. So it is this sort of mental block that's preventing people from being able to evaluate companies, evaluate new entrepreneurs on their own metrics. But what's so interesting is that it's hard to look at data if you're investing based on entrepreneurs and ideas, right? Like there aren't a lot of numbers to back that up. And I'm certainly someone who really loves numbers, which is why I put so many into my book. But one company called First Round Capital, it was a VC fund. They're based out of Philadelphia. They invest in very early stages. And so they weren't making bets based on growth rates or profitability, but more based on the entrepreneur. After their first decade of operations, investing in hundreds of companies, they said, hey, we should go back and figure out what worked. Is it people who are based in Silicon Valley? Is it co-founder teams rather than single founders? Like, let's dig through the data. Now that these companies have been around for a while, let's figure out what worked. So what they discovered was something they had not been looking for. They discovered that that their female-led companies yielded 63% higher profits. To me, that's so dramatic. Not only is that not a statistical error, but 63%, they hadn't even realized that, and they hadn't been looking for that. But once they saw those numbers, they hired more female investors because female investors are twice as likely to invest in a female-led company than male investors, and they changed the way their meetings worked. Before, someone would come in for a pitch and then everyone would sit around and talk about the pitch afterwards. What they realized is that that format was not letting everyone really have a voice. Sometimes the loudest person would just steamroll everyone else, and then they would do whatever that loud guy had proposed. So what they did instead is they made sure that everyone had a chance to vote on the company they had just seen and put forward their perspective before they had an open conversation. And that guaranteed, once everyone got their vote in there, that people got to really share what they believed and not worry that other people might have a different opinion and they were going to win because they were the louder voice. And that was really something to enable everyone to share their perspective. So this is, to me, so inspiring because it's an example of a company that is making changes, an investment fund that is making changes because they realized that they were missing out at an opportunity. When they saw that female-led companies were generating 63% higher profits, the man who was in charge said, why aren't we investing in more of them? So I feel like if people look at the data, they will follow the data and greater investment and diversity will follow.
We're going to take a break, but we'll be right back with more of author Julia Boorstin and much more Women Lead. Don't go away.
At the Women of Color Empowerment Institute, our mission is to enhance and expand leadership by women of color. We do this in a variety of different ways, including but not limited to providing mentorship opportunities for young professionals where we assist in helping to create paths to leadership. We empower women to develop capacities for social change. We produce programs that promote heritage awareness, and we provide training opportunities for business and government. Our institute holds seminars focused on professional success techniques, and we host many other events such as our popular Advocates for Change and Leaders Connect. The Women of Color Empowerment Institute publishes a magazine called Women Lead. Our signature event is the Women of Color Empowerment Conference, a yearly conference where hundreds of leaders gather from all across the United States and beyond. To learn more about membership and how you can support our programs or be a sponsor of the Women Lead TV, visit us at nationalwomenofcolor.com. Again, that's nationalwomenofcolor.com. Welcome back to Women Lead. We're having a terrific conversation with author and journalist Julia Boorstin about When Women Lead, the title of her new amazing book.
Julia, you make great points about working in environments in which there's bias, which is still present for women and people of color in many areas of business, but determining what actionable steps to take to move forward and succeed. What do you mean, and can you give us any examples from your case studies?
So in terms of navigating bias, there are so many different kinds of bias in the workplace. And I dug through literally hundreds of studies. And I think there are 50 studies alone on all the different ways women face double standards. Women are judged more harshly if they show any emotion in the workplace. They're judged more harshly if they use humor in the workplace. Women, can you imagine being judged more harshly for making a joke in the office? Women are judged more harshly if they give any kind of feedback. Women are judged more harshly if they're not nurturing all the time. They're also judged more harshly if they succeed in a male-led field. There's so many different double standards. You could contort yourself into a pretzel and you would never meet all of these different expectations of women in particular. And then for women of color, there's another level of bias on top of that. I have a section in my book on intersectionality and how multiple identities can create additional bias. Ultimately, women and women of color are judged more harshly because they do not they do not fit into the stereotype of what people think of as leadership in business. From my perspective, that is an old, outdated, broken stereotype, and we need to move away from it. And that's one reason why I want to share these amazing stories of women in my book who do not fit the stereotype, and they are succeeding and thriving. One thing I found, and I heard a lot about from women I interviewed, is this idea that if you understand the data, if you understand what you're up against, it's easier for you to navigate it. So for instance, there's one woman I interviewed, her name is Kim Taylor, and she'd read this study about how female bosses are judged more harshly if they give really negative feedback to their employees, and that their employees just hate their female bosses much more than they would a male boss for giving exactly the same feedback. Obviously, that's ridiculous and unfair, but in this phase of her business's growth, Kim did not have time to deal with that. She did not have time to deal with the blowback. So she told me, she's like, look, ultimately, I hope we can get to a place where men and women can give feedback equally. But she said, on that day, I took what I learned from that study, and I got one of the guys who works for me to go give the negative feedback. I said, here's exactly what you need to say. Go give the feedback, and I'm going to move on with my day and not have to deal with the employee blowback. So that doesn't like make a big change for the future, but in that moment, it helped her navigate it. Another thing I learned from one of the women in the book, her name is Aya Badir, and she's a Lebanese immigrant. And she told me crazy stories of bias and discrimination she faced. She said, people discriminated against me because I'm an immigrant, because I'm Lebanese, because I'm a different religion than most of the people I've ever met. And she said, I'm a woman, I'm a female engineer. People would ask her questions like, where's the white guy who's going to run your company? And she said it was just crazy. So I asked her, how did you not let that get you down? How did you manage to have the grit and perseverance to not let that kind of stuff make you want to quit? And what she told me is that she thinks of dealing with bias like remembering to wear a jacket when it's cold out. So when she would go into these meetings, she would like bring her jacket and she would say, I know I'm going to face some bias and discrimination in these pitch meetings, but if I can have my preparation around me, then I can separate out the comments that are biased with the valuable feedback. And so having an understanding of the statistics, of the data, can enable you to be more prepared. Another very important one that I heard a lot of women talk to me about is this idea that when women go into pitch meetings, because they don't fit that stereotype of what entrepreneurs or what leaders are supposed to look like, women are actually asked different questions from investors than male founders are asked. Women are more likely to be asked about the downside risks. Well, what are you going to do if the economy tanks? What are you going to do if you have a supply chain issue? They're asked like about worst case scenarios. So the women I talked to who knew about that research, they told me they would go into the pitch meetings. Predictably, they'd be asked about worst case scenarios. They'd quickly answer and they'd say, but let me tell you what I think is our best case scenario. So they figured out how to use that knowledge as power. And ultimately, and the reason I put so much research and so much data in the book is because I do believe that data can overcome bias and that knowledge for women, knowledge really is power. The women in my book wanted to create long-standing companies that could have massive impact over the long run. And they told me they knew that if they were nonprofits, they would be at the whim of too many other people. They wanted to have sustainable impact. If you're generating profits and in success, you're helping people, that's what's going to work for the long run. And I'm increasingly seeing women understand that starting a for-profit company, you can really have massive impact and help the world.
Julia Boorstin, thank you so much for this engrossing conversation. You are truly a woman who walks your talk. The book is When Women Lead, What We Achieve, Why We Succeed, and What We Can Learn. Well, that's all the time we have today. And until the next time, be empowered.